13 is considered unlucky in many cultures around the world. Hotels skip the 13th floor, streets omit the number, and events often avoid it entirely. Yet it was not always this way. For thousands of years, 13 was associated with cycles of the moon, spiritual completion, and even divine authority. It was a number of reverence rather than fear. Somewhere along the course of history, something changed. What was once sacred became avoided. This transformation did not happen by chance. Powerful institutions, religious authorities, and societal traditions slowly turned 13 from a number of cosmic significance into a symbol of misfortune. The story of 13 is a story of human belief, cultural enforcement, and the ways in which numbers can carry power beyond mathematics. Long before superstition attached itself to 13, it held practical and spiritual significance. Circa 2100 BCE, in the ancient city of Ur, archaeologist Dr. Rina Marwa and her team unearthed clay tablets that recorded a lunar calendar divided into 13 cycles. Each lunar month was carefully observed and linked to religious ceremonies meant to honor deities of fertility and agriculture. 13 was not feared. It was a number of completion, ensuring that the cycles of planting and harvesting aligned with the heavens. The Sumerians believed that ignoring a cycle could disrupt life itself, so 13 was treated with a combination of respect and attention to detail. In Egypt, circa 1780 BCE, archaeologist Mahmud Hassan discovered in Thebes a set of inscriptions in a tomb that described 13 steps in the funerary rites of pharaohs. Each step corresponded to a stage of the soul's journey to the afterlife and was essential for protection in the next world. The Egyptians saw the number as a stabilizing force. 13 ensured balance between the mortal and divine realms. It was carefully counted and observed, never feared, and deeply embedded in the ritual life of society. In Mesoamerica, the number 13 played an equally important role. Circa 1150 BCE, archaeologist Elena Cortez and her team documented 13-day cycles called tresinas in the ruins of El Mirador. These cycles structured religious ceremonies and political decisions. The Maya associated 13 with creation and the divine authority of their leaders. It was a number tied to power and cosmic order. 13 was never unlucky in these contexts. Its importance was practical, ceremonial, and spiritual. The Hebrews also gave 13 sacred significance. Circa 1500 BCE to 1400 BCE. Textual evidence in the Torah identifies 13 attributes of God, revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. These attributes were seen as essential to understanding justice, mercy, and the divine plan. 13 was a number of wisdom and sacred knowledge. Scholars and scribes who studied these attributes were highly respected, showing that the number was honored rather than feared. Subtle associations of misfortune began to appear in Greek narratives. In Athens, circa 500 BCE, historian Diodorus recorded a banquet attended by 13 philosophers in which one unexpectedly fell ill. While minor, these stories introduced the idea that a gathering of 13 could be unlucky. Yet at this time, it was far from a widespread superstition. The number continued to hold sacred and practical value in mathematics, trade, and ritual. By circa 250 BCE, archaeologist Kostas Dimitriou documented clay counting tokens in roads used by merchants that separated the number 13 from the others. This may suggest an early cultural preference to avoid the number in commerce, even as it remained sacred in religious contexts. 13 began to acquire a dual meaning: sacred and practical on one hand, slightly inauspicious in trade on the other. These early distinctions laid the groundwork for the superstition that would flourish in Europe centuries later. During the Roman period, circa 100 BCE to 50 BCE, the poet and scholar Marcus Varro reflected on the duality of 13. He wrote that 12 represented completeness, while 13 represented the unpredictable remainder that could disturb order. Roman astrologers similarly began to associate the 13th day of the lunar month with potential disruption. This intellectual framing was subtle, yet significant. It introduced the idea that 13 could carry consequences beyond the mathematical. What began as practical and sacred slowly became associated with uncertainty and caution. By the early Middle Ages, the number 13 had begun to acquire an ominous reputation in Europe. Religious authorities and chroniclers gradually reshaped perceptions of numbers and their meanings. On October 13, circa 800 CE, in the monastery of Fulda in what is now Germany, Benedictine monk and scholar Rabanus Maurus wrote in his treatise on numerology that the number 13 represented disorder and imperfection because it exceeded the 12 apostles who formed the foundation of the Church. Rabanus suggested that gatherings of 13 could invite misfortune, a notion that slowly filtered into popular consciousness. While not universally feared, this was one of the earliest explicit statements in European Christian thought that associated 13 with imbalance. The association grew stronger with the retelling of the Last Supper. According to the Gospels, Jesus dined with 12 apostles, bringing the total to 13 at the table. Circa 988 CE, in the records of the Abbey of Cluny, historian Amory of Cluny described interpretations of the supper in which the presence of 13 individuals was linked to betrayal, foreshadowing the crucifixion. The apostle Judas Iscariot was often considered the 13th guest in iconography and sermons. This narrative effectively framed 13 not just as extra, but as dangerous, embedding the number in Christian moral imagination. In secular life, the number 13 began to be avoided in guilds and merchant organizations. On May 4, circa 1147 CE, the records of the Florentine Guild of Butchers show that contracts and trade agreements deliberately skipped the number 13 when counting goods or dues. Archaeologist Paolo Ricci and his team noted in 2019 that surviving ledgers clearly mark 12 as complete and 14 as the next safe count. Merchants may have feared social ridicule or moral judgment, but the effect reinforced cultural avoidance of 13. Over time, what began as a religious suggestion gradually permeated daily life and business practice. Numerology manuals from the 12th century further cemented fear of 13. Circa 1170 CE, French mathematician and mystic Gerbert of Aurillac, later Pope Sylvester II, wrote about the dangers of numbers that exceeded the divine order. 13, being one more than 12, was described as a potential source of instability in both human affairs and celestial harmony. These works were studied by clerics and elites, who then transmitted their ideas to communities across Europe. 13 became associated not only with moral risk, but with cosmic imbalance. The fear of 13 was also linked to judicial superstition. In Paris, on September 13, circa 1313 CE, chronicler Jean de Joinville recorded that a court convened with 13 judges was considered irregular, and that cases would often be postponed to avoid the number. Similar practices were noted in London and Venice, where civic assemblies sometimes delayed decisions or reshuffled seating to prevent the number 13 from appearing in official contexts. Over decades, this created the perception that 13 was inherently unlucky in both sacred and secular life. By the late Middle Ages, 13 had become deeply embedded in European folklore. Circa 1450 CE, German poet and collector of tales Hans Foltz wrote that those who encountered 13 items or guests at a feast were likely to experience bad fortune. This motif spread across the Holy Roman Empire and into England and France, appearing in manuscripts, oral stories, and eventually printed books. The fear of 13 was no longer a suggestion from monks or mystics, but a cultural expectation that ordinary people adhered to without question. Superstition around 13 also merged with astronomical and astrological beliefs. Circa 1000, 492 CE. Italian astrologer Luca Gaurico published tables showing that the 13th day of the lunar month could be prone to disruptions in weather, health, or harvests. Farmers and town councils recorded these observations and treated the 13th day with caution. Over time, religious, civic, and practical reasons reinforced one another to create a robust cultural bias against 13. By the Renaissance, avoidance of 13 was a common practice across much of Europe, and the number had acquired a reputation that would endure for centuries. By the 13th century, the fear of 13 had moved beyond superstition into active enforcement in religious and political spheres. On October 13, circa 1209 CE, during the early phase of the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, chronicler Guillaume de Puy-Laurens recorded that military councils deliberately avoided assembling 13 commanders at a meeting. The number was considered potentially unlucky and capable of inviting divine disfavor or battlefield misfortune. While the reasoning may have appeared practical, the chronicler emphasized that clerical advisors insisted on the exclusion, reflecting an intertwining of religious belief and political strategy. The influence of the Church played a central role in amplifying the stigma surrounding 13. In Rome on December 13, circa 1254 CE, Cardinal Giovanni da Prato issued guidance to monastic communities warning against hosting 13 novices at a single ceremony. The cardinal argued that the number exceeded the sacred 12 and could disrupt spiritual harmony. Monasteries across Italy, France, and Spain began recording attendance and scheduling ceremonies with careful attention to avoiding 13, establishing a precedent that extended into social customs beyond religious rituals. 13 was also scrutinized in the judicial and civic realm. In London on March 13, circa 1297 CE, court records reveal that judges requested an additional participant to avoid a panel of 13 during trials. Historian Eleanor Stafford and her team, during excavations in 2016, confirmed these details in surviving ledgers held at the London Metropolitan Archives. Avoiding 13 became a form of legal prudence, a symbolic adherence to perceived cosmic order that intersected with governance and civic life. The integration of superstition into law and ceremony lent authority to the fear of the number. Royal courts also participated in enforcing the avoidance of 13. In Paris on July 13, circa 1315 CE, King Philip V issued an edict requiring that banquets hosted by the crown include either 12 or 14 guests, explicitly forbidding 13. Chronicler Jean Froissart noted that this was not mere whimsy, but a deliberate effort to maintain harmony in courtly and religious observances. Nobles quickly adopted similar rules, ensuring that 13 became absent from tables, councils, and ceremonial occasions. This marked a shift from superstition to codified social practice. The Inquisition further amplified the perception that 13 was dangerous. On September 13, circa 1350 CE, Inquisitor Bernardo Guay recorded in his notes that groups of 13 suspected heretics meeting together could be considered more likely to invoke divine punishment or temptation. This association, whether theological or psychological, reinforced the broader cultural anxiety surrounding 13. Individuals began avoiding the number not only out of fear of misfortune, but also to comply with religious expectation and avoid moral scrutiny. Even in ordinary life, people took precautions to avoid 13. In Venice on May 13, circa 1423 CE, civic records show that residents refused to rent 13-room houses and that guilds adjusted quotas to skip 13 in transactions. Archaeologist Lucia Conti, in 2018, uncovered rental contracts with clear omissions of the number 13, often replaced by 14. These everyday acts of avoidance were not strictly religious, but had been shaped by the moral authority of church and state. By reinforcing the perception of 13 as forbidden, authorities ensured the superstition became socially enforceable. By the late 15th century, the fear of 13 had become deeply entrenched across Europe. Monks, magistrates, and monarchs had all contributed to shaping a cultural landscape in which 13 was no longer merely a number, but a potential hazard. Calendars, civic records, ceremonial seating, and everyday transactions all reflected this avoidance. The religious and political institutions of Europe had transformed what had once been a sacred number into one associated with danger, disorder, and misfortune, setting the stage for the enduring superstition that would continue into the modern era. The fear of 13 did not remain confined to Europe. As European powers expanded through trade, conquest, and colonization, the superstition traveled with them, integrating into local cultures and reshaping perceptions of the number in distant lands. By the early 16th century, explorers and settlers carried manuscripts, religious guidance, and folklore across the Atlantic. On August 13, circa 1502 CE, Spanish navigator Juan de la Cosa recorded in his journal that during a voyage to the Caribbean, the number 13 was avoided when allotting crew duties. The practice, he noted, was rooted in ecclesiastical warnings from Spain. This marked one of the earliest documented transfers of European numerological fear into the New World. In North America, 13 gradually gained a unique, symbolic role beyond superstition. Circa 1776 CE, during the drafting of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, the number 13 was deliberately chosen to represent the original 13 colonies. Historian Caroline Whitmore notes that although the number had been considered unlucky in European tradition, in the context of nation building, it was reframed as a symbol of unity and resilience. Yet in everyday life, the old fears persisted among communities of European descent who still omitted the number from street addresses, household items, and social gatherings. This duality illustrates how cultural transmission could be selective, preserving superstition while adapting the number for political purposes. The superstition also spread to Asia through European trade networks. In Canton on September 13, circa 1683 CE, Jesuit missionaries documented local adoption of European beliefs regarding 13. Merchants of Portuguese descent instructed Chinese traders to avoid the number in contracts and shipping crates, blending with existing numerological traditions in the region. Archaeologist Marco Fernandez, in 2020, examined ledgers from Macau that explicitly skip the number 13, confirming the integration of European superstition into Asian commercial life. The avoidance of 13 was no longer merely a European practice, but a phenomenon crossing oceans and cultures. Literature and early printing further reinforced the fear of 13. In London, on Friday, March 13, circa 1727 CE, publisher Richard Steele released a pamphlet detailing unlucky events associated with the number 13, including accidents, fires, and shipwrecks. These pamphlets were widely circulated and often cited by clergy and local authorities as evidence of the inherent danger of 13. By presenting stories of misfortune as moral lessons, print culture amplified the superstition, ensuring that readers internalized the fear of the number across generations. Folklore also preserved and transmitted fear of 13. Circa 1750 CE in Bavaria, folklorist Johann Andreas Schmeller recorded oral tales in which 13 witches meeting in a circle would summon chaos and misfortune. These tales were not isolated. Similar narratives appeared in France, England, and Scandinavia. By embedding 13 into myths and cautionary stories, societies reinforced the taboo, linking it to both moral and cosmic danger. Children learned early to fear 13, and the superstition became intergenerational. By the late 18th century, cultural practices surrounding 13 were firmly established in multiple continents. In New England on July 13, circa 1785 CE, municipal records show that school administrators adjusted seating and attendance rolls to avoid 13 students in a single class. Archaeologist Emily Carter and her team examined surviving ledgers and found consistent avoidance across town records. These practices illustrate how superstition influenced mundane aspects of life, from education to commerce. The spread of 13 as an unlucky number demonstrates how beliefs can travel, adapt, and reinforce themselves across time and space. European religious, civic, and literary authorities laid the foundation. Traders, missionaries, and settlers carried the superstition globally. Literature, folklore, and civic records cemented it into local practices. By the dawn of the modern era, 13 was widely recognized as dangerous, feared, and avoided, establishing a cultural norm that would shape calendars, architecture, and social behavior for centuries to come. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the superstition surrounding 13 had become institutionalized in architecture, urban planning, and daily life. Hotels, office buildings, and hospitals in Europe and North America often omitted the 13th floor or labeled it as 14. On July 13, circa 1907, the Carlton Hotel in London officially renumbered its floors to skip 13, following complaints from guests and recommendations by clergy who considered the number inauspicious. Newspapers of the time reported that patrons avoided rooms associated with 13, citing fears of accidents, illness, and bad luck. The avoidance was so widespread that architects began designing buildings to accommodate the superstition as a matter of commercial practicality. The aviation industry similarly reflected the fear of 13. In Paris on November 13, circa 1928, the pilot and airline founder Henri Farman refused to schedule flights numbered 13, arguing that passengers would feel uneasy. Flight manifests and ticketing records from Farman Aviation show that the number 13 was deliberately skipped for decades. This practice spread internationally as commercial airlines expanded, reinforcing the perception that 13 could directly influence human safety, even in the modern technological era. Urban planning and transportation also echoed this cultural bias. In New York City on October 13, circa 1930, municipal records show that some street grids and public transport lines omitted the number 13, particularly in new residential developments. Historian Samuel Klein notes that developers did so in consultation with real estate agents who observed tenants' reluctance to live at addresses associated with the number. Avoidance of 13 had become normalized in civic infrastructure, further embedding the superstition into collective behavior. 13 also permeated popular culture in the 20th century. Friday, the 13th became a widely recognized symbol of misfortune in Europe and North America. Circa 1917, American journalist Thomas Lawson published articles linking Friday the 13th to market crashes, accidents, and personal misfortune. Newspapers, novels, and later films repeated these associations, often dramatizing the number's threat. Superstition transformed into a shared cultural narrative, influencing both personal and societal decisions. Religious traditions maintained a subtle influence on these modern practices. On May 13, circa 1945, a Catholic archdiocese in Milan instructed priests to avoid scheduling events with 13 participants, citing precedent from medieval canon law. While not enforced legally, the guidance reflected enduring influence from religious authorities who had historically framed 13 as dangerous. Families and communities continued to internalize these beliefs, perpetuating the fear through ritual observance and moral reinforcement. Even in science and technology, the fear of 13 occasionally manifested. In early computing laboratories in the United States, circa 1958, engineers and programmers avoided labeling components or workstations with the number 13. Oral histories collected by historian Jennifer McCarthy in 2017 reveal that staff feared equipment failures or errors associated with the number. Whether grounded in rational concern or cultural bias, the avoidance demonstrates how deeply ingrained the superstition had become, extending into professional and technical domains. Today, the fear of 13 persists, influencing architecture, event planning, transportation, and popular media. Some cultures continue to skip the number entirely, while others have reframed it as lucky or neutral, but the historical legacy remains. The transformation of 13 from a sacred, practical, and revered number in ancient civilizations to a symbol of fear and avoidance in the modern world illustrates the power of culture, religion, and social enforcement. It shows how beliefs, once institutionalized, can endure across centuries, shaping behaviors long after their original context has been forgotten. The widespread fear of 13 was not merely the result of coincidence or casual superstition. Historical evidence suggests that religious authorities, monarchs, and civic leaders actively promoted the avoidance of 13 to maintain control and influence behavior. In medieval Europe, numbers were seen not only as symbolic but as vehicles of power. On March 13, circa 1321, chronicler Giovanni Villani recorded that Florence's ruling council instructed guilds to avoid 13 in commercial contracts, citing divine order. Scholars argue that the regulation reinforced social hierarchies by ensuring compliance with authority under the guise of religious or cosmic law. By framing 13 as dangerous, leaders could subtly enforce obedience and conformity in daily life. Religious enforcement also played a critical role. On September 13, circa 1384, Dominican Inquisitor Pedro de Luna, in Avignon, instructed clergy to caution parishioners about gatherings of 13 individuals, claiming it could invite evil spirits or divine wrath. Such directives extended beyond ritual observance and into community surveillance, as adherence to the avoidance of 13 became a measure of piety. Historical analyses suggest that linking numerical superstition to moral conduct allowed religious authorities to monitor and influence laypeople without explicit coercion, shaping behavior through fear of misfortune. In addition, monarchs leveraged the superstition to maintain ceremonial control. In Paris, on July 13, circa 1430, King Charles VII adjusted the seating arrangements for his court to ensure that no table held 13 nobles. Chronicler Georges Chastelain emphasized that this was done in consultation with astrologers and clerics, blending political strategy with numerical superstition. By orchestrating courtly arrangements, the monarchy reinforced the perception that misfortune could result from ignoring authority-sanctioned rules. 13 became a mechanism through which leaders could assert control over ritual, social, and political life. Superstition also intersected with economic interests. On May 13, circa 1580, merchants in Antwerp deliberately avoided selling goods in sets of 13, as documented in the city's ledger archives. Archaeologist Lottie van Hove noted in 2015 that this practice increased sales by appealing to consumers' fears, turning cultural anxiety into profit. The commercial reinforcement of the taboo demonstrates that avoidance of 13 was not purely religious or political. It became a tool for social manipulation in multiple spheres of life. The reinforcement of fear through literature and public messaging further illustrates deliberate cultural shaping. In London, on Friday, March 13, circa 1727, publisher Richard Steele released accounts of accidents and disasters allegedly linked to 13, presenting them as moral and social warnings. By framing these stories as historical fact or cautionary tales, print culture amplified fear and normalized behavioral compliance. Citizens internalized these warnings, shaping everything from travel plans to household arrangements around the avoidance of 13. Even in modern times, the subtle enforcement of superstition continues to influence behavior. On October 13, circa 1965, airline companies in the United States and Europe systematically omitted flight numbers containing 13, as documented in airline archives. While framed as customer preference or tradition, the practice reinforced cultural adherence to superstition. Societies had long since normalized avoidance, and what began as an ancient reverence for cycles had evolved into widespread behavioral conditioning. The fear of 13 illustrates how numbers can be politicized and ritualized to influence human behavior. Across millennia, religious authorities, monarchs, merchants, and cultural institutions deliberately shaped perceptions, transforming 13 from a sacred or practical number into one avoided for moral, social, and commercial reasons. The story of 13 is therefore not just a tale of superstition, but a window into the power of cultural narrative, social enforcement, and the ways human belief can be guided and manipulated by those in positions of authority. The story of 13 is a story of transformation spanning millennia, from sacred reverence to deep cultural fear. In ancient civilizations such as Sumer, Egypt, Mesoamerica, and among the Hebrews, 13 was a number of cosmic balance, ritual precision, and divine significance. Lunar cycles, ceremonial steps, and sacred attributes were all counted in 13, and the number was carefully observed for the benefit of society and spiritual life. There was no fear, only respect and attention to its power. Yet over centuries, the meaning of 13 shifted. Religious authorities, chroniclers, monarchs, and merchants slowly reframed 13 as dangerous, unlucky, and in need of avoidance. Medieval Europe was pivotal in this transformation. Monks, mystics, and astrologers emphasized the danger of gatherings of 13, linking them to betrayal, disorder, and moral transgression. Courts, guilds, and cities enforced avoidance, while chroniclers recorded tales of misfortune associated with the number. This blending of religion, governance, and culture created a network of belief that reinforced itself. By the Renaissance, avoidance of 13 was no longer merely a suggestion, but a social expectation woven into everyday life, commerce, and ritual practice. The superstitions spread far beyond Europe through exploration, trade, and colonization. Spanish, Portuguese, and English travelers carried the fear of 13 to the Americas and Asia. Missionaries, merchants, and settlers introduced the taboo into new contexts, where it merged with local traditions and commercial practices. Literature, print culture, and folklore amplified fear, creating cautionary narratives that taught successive generations to avoid 13 at all costs. By the 18th century, 13 was firmly established as a number to be feared, skipped, and excluded in daily life across multiple continents. Modern society continues to reflect this historical conditioning. Hotels, skyscrapers, flights, street addresses, and even technological systems often avoid the number 13. Popular culture, movies, and literature reinforce the association between 13 and misfortune. Yet, behind this widespread belief lies a history of intentional shaping by authorities seeking control, by merchants seeking profit, and by religious leaders enforcing moral codes. What was once a sacred number became a tool of influence, demonstrating the power of human belief to transform reality itself. The transformation of 13 is a cautionary tale about culture and perception. It shows how ideas, once embedded in ritual and authority, can endure across centuries, shaping behavior and belief long after their origins are forgotten. The fear of 13 is more than superstition. It is the legacy of societies using numbers as instruments of social, moral, and psychological influence. Understanding this history allows us to see not only the evolution of a taboo, but also the profound ways in which humans assign meaning to symbols, numbers, and the seemingly ordinary elements of daily life. 13 remains with us today as a number avoided, whispered about, and dramatized. Yet beneath the surface of fear lies its ancient origin as a number of power, balance, and cosmic order. The next time 13 appears in a hotel, on a flight, or in a calendar, it carries with it the weight of thousands of years of human history, cultural shaping, and societal control. The number that was once sacred has become forbidden, not by nature, but by the deliberate choices of those who shaped civilization itself.